In today's video, we will be analyzing the 2023 governor elections in the states of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Kentucky. Louisiana has already been projected to go to the Republican Party, so I'm going to analyze the two remaining states. Now, first off, in the state of Louisiana. Now, the state already we know have went to the Republican Party, but nonetheless, we're still going to cover it. So let's give us some background information. In 2015, John Bel Edwards defeated the Republican by more than 12% in the runoff. Now, in case you're wondering why there's a runoff election and etc., John Bel Edwards was term limited. In the state of Louisiana, you can only run for 2 terms or 8 years as the governor before you're forced to retire and not be able to run again. And in the state, there's a runoff election, which means that you need 50% of the vote to end up winning the first round. Otherwise, it goes to a runoff where the top two candidates advance. And since that there's only 2 candidates, one candidate has to reach more than 50%. Now, in 2019, we did see that John Bel Edwards nearly defeated Eddie Raspone. Now, in 2023, the election already happened. Jeff Landry got 51.6% of the vote in the first round, so he nearly crossed the 50% margin, which means that he would avoid a runoff. Now, the election happened just a day ago, so to speak, and Jeff Landry didn't end up winning. He barely again met over the 50% margin, but that means it will not be a runoff election because he has obviously won. Now, this was not much of a surprise. Polling consistently suggested that Landry would win the election. Predictions, it ranged from lean R to safe R, but realistically, we all knew that Landry was going to end up winning. The question was it going to go to a runoff? Now, most people expected it to go to a runoff. As you can see, all the polling suggested that a runoff was most probable. Nonetheless, we did see that Landry end up cracking 50% and it end up avoiding the runoff. Now, the 2 other elections this year will be more competitive and therefore more interesting. Let's start off with Mississippi. In 2019 here, we did see that Tate Reeves narrowly defeated Jim Hood, the Democratic challenger, by just over 5 points. But what's interesting in the state of Mississippi is that they actually evaluate it by electoral votes. It's a pretty complicated system. Essentially, they take electoral districts, and then if you win a district, for example, you get the amount of delegates that's allocated. Essentially, you need more than half of the delegates, and typically, by doing that, you probably have to win the popular vote. It's a pretty complicated system nonetheless. And in 2019, Tate Reeves, the Republican, won both the popular vote and the delegate vote. Now, in 2015, Phil Brent easily won the state by 33 points. 2019, it became competitive. If you look at the general election here, we see that most of the rankings had it as lean R. This was not very definitive, but nonetheless, most people did expect the Republicans to win. And although the margin was close, I think most people predicted this outcome. Now, in 2023, Tate Reeves will face Brandon Presley, the Democratic candidate. Now, in the general election here, we see that predictions range from lean R to safe R. Now, my prediction is obviously that Republicans are going to win. It's pretty consistent with all the predictions. The question is it going to be a lean margin, a likely margin, or a safe margin? Now, Tate Reeves is not the most popular Republican. We see that in the primary, there were actually 2 challengers who actually took away 25% of the vote. That's typically not the best sign, but nonetheless, it's not like that Tate Reeves won by a narrow margin. He is more than fine. Democrats, Brandon Presley was unchallenged because Democrats knew they were probably not going to end up winning this race. Now, I do believe Mississippi will probably go to Republicans by around 10 points, which is short of a safe margin, but nonetheless an overperformance from 2019. Now, the 2023 Kentucky governor's election will by far be the most intense and interesting. Andy Beshear in 2019, the Democrat, won in this hugely Republican state by just a margin of 0.4 percentage points, or just over 5,000 votes. This race was very competitive. Going into the general election, we did see that this race, again, very, very competitive. We did see 2 toss-up categories and really labels, but surpassed those crystal ball headed as lean Republican. I think more people expected the Republicans to win, but this was definitely a very competitive race. The endorsements, you saw Republicans obviously endorsing Matt Bevin, Democrats endorsing Andy Beshear. Polling suggested that this race was very close. Andy Beshear had the early lead, but when it was election day, it became very close. Most people, despite the polling, believed that Andy Beshear was nonetheless going to end up win. But still, this was a very competitive race. Ultimately, Andy Beshear prevailed because his father, Steve Beshear, just a couple of elections ago, won his election by a huge margin. And again, Steve Beshear, the Beshear name is just very well known in the state of Kentucky, that ultimately prevailed in this race. Now, Daniel Cameron will face against Andy Beshear. Now, for the general election, predictions have it as lean or tilt D. Mostly Elections Daily has it as a toss-up. We did see that Republicans fell short of 50. None of the Republicans were actually able to reach the 50% mark in the Republican primary. Andy Beshear obviously faced a little challenge. But this is not a good sign for Republicans because that means there is still some division in the Republican Party. And given how narrow this race is expected to be, this could ultimately make or break the race. According to the polling here, we do see that Andy Beshear holds a substantial lead over Daniel Cameron. Now, it is important to note that in 2019 as well, Andy Beshear led in much of the polling before being overtaken in the final couple of days in the polling election cycle. Nonetheless speaking, right now, it just does not seem like Andy Beshear is gonna end up ultimately prevailing. That the Republicans are ultimately going to end up prevailing in this race. However, it is important to note that Andy Beshear is not crossing necessarily 50%, which is needed to win an election. Now, he's very close to that, but he's not actually on that number. We see that Daniel Cameron falls around 40% of the vote. It does seem like that Emerson College, one of the more credible polls, is actually having this as Andy Beshear plus 16, but I think that that's because many Republicans don't know who Daniel Cameron is, and I think that the R next to their name will ultimately prevail. I do believe that Andy Beshear is favored based on all the polling and all the characterizations we saw. After all, Andy Beshear this time around also has the advantage of being the incumbent, while Daniel Cameron as the challenger, and that the incumbency does end up mattering more in a statewide election, especially in a governor-wide election. So when I take all the factors into consideration, I think Kentucky will probably go to Andy Beshear by the ballpark of about 3 to 4 points. This is combining the other electoral vote models, the ultimate polling rate right now, which does not look good for Daniel Cameron, and also the historic factors as well as the 2019 election. Thank you for watching. Have a nice day. Goodbye.